Good morning. I am Dr. Supriya Manloi from the Department of English, PSS College, Bhopal. I am going to give an introductory lecture on criticism where we will cover certain aspects of criticism such as what is literature, what is criticism, role of a critic and the purpose and function of literary criticism. Before we understand criticism, it is important for us to understand literature. As all of us are aware that literature is a body of literary work. It is usually a collection of writings in a given language proper to a nation and its people. But more important than that, literature is a creative writing of recognized artistic value. When we say recognized artistic value, it is important for us to understand this recognition because it is only this recognition which imparts that value which we assign to literary pieces. In literature, the writer and his work play a key role. The writer, his flights of imagination, his way of looking at various aspects of life constitutes his collective expression in a writing which we later on term as literature. This literature is a mirror to the age in which the writer lives. Since the writer is recording his ideas, his expressions, his imagination, it is very important for us to look at it from a critical and scientific perspective because for times literature has always been under that scanner as the role and function it is performing, because it does not fall in the category of scientific writings like natural sciences where we bring in astronomy, medical sciences, mathematics. Hence the critical inquiry becomes necessary and important. The famous critique and poet Matthew Arnold had once commented upon literature saying that it is the record of best that is known and thought in the world. Now how do we know what is best and what is thought and known in the world? Who will bring this to the knowledge of average and reading public? It is the critic who brings and does that for us. Hence Matthew Arnold had summarized the importance of literature in these phenomenal lines. When does a text become literature? Now, every writing that is written by a writer or a poet cannot immediately become a piece of literature. It has to go under certain processes of scrutiny, certain processes of evaluation, which will give that credibility to that piece before it can be called as literature. It has to stand the test of time. It has to have a certain artistic value. It has to have acceptance and appreciation beyond geographical boundaries. And when we say beyond geographical boundaries, it is important for us to know which boundaries are we talking about. So it has to be universal in nature, then only it becomes literature. And last and most important is that it lends itself to multiple interpretations. One piece of writing, when it can be read by different people with different layers of meaning so that each one of us has his own perception of that writing, then it can be called literature. How does one approach literature? In order to understand literature, it is very important to approach literature in a systematic designed manner. The very basic ones are the text, the author's note, the background to the age, but most important of it is the critical perception of critiques on that particular piece of writing. Here the role of a critic becomes important, and this brings us to the topic that I will be taking in my lecture today, that is Introduction to Criticism. The critic. Criticism in arts. Since time immemorial, arts, subjects of social sciences have always been under a kind of a questioning by the people from the scientific community because they felt that they do not have anything that can be evaluated and assessed because they are just pure pleasure and fun. They are used for luxury. People can, just spend a good time with them and that's it. Their contribution, their utility towards society cannot be measured. Plato was the first one who commented upon the role of literature, especially poetry, in his famous work, The Republic, where he questioned the role of a poet in society. And it was since then that literature along with other genres of arts came under scrutiny by critics, and that is how we arrived at this field of literary criticism. In order to understand literary criticism, let us go through certain definitions of literary criticism. The very fundamental definition of literary criticism is that it is the study, discussion, evaluation and interpretation of literature. If you notice the use of certain terms which have a similarity, a study, a discussion, and evaluation and interpretation. We talk about literature, we study literature, we don't just read it for pleasure, we don't just read it for pure fun. We are going deep into the various lines that are composed by the writer, the poet, and then we are evaluating it. This includes the classification by genre, by structure, and evaluating and judging the value of a piece, a code by Beckinson and Gans. Genre, structure and value, yes, they are very important when we study literature. Literature is identified in terms of poetry, drama, fiction, prose. Further, it has a structure where we study various elements of poetry, where we might study different acts in a play. So, understanding the structure becomes important. And finally, what value does it has? What value does it impart to the society? Again, aren't we conducting experiment in evaluating a literary piece? Yes, we are conducting an experiment where we come to know the artistic value of that piece, which is going to help the society to understand humanity in a much better manner. Different schools of literary criticism provides us with lenses which ultimately reveal important aspects of the literary work. Yes, lenses, because it is only through lenses that we are able to do and undertake a close scrutiny of a piece. A work is repeatedly read by the critic, and these different schools of criticism such as formalism, feminism, eco-criticism, they have their own ideologies which dominate a critical evaluation. For example, the feminist school of criticism might evaluate a piece of criticism on the basis of how does it presents the women of a contemporary society, or what is the role of a woman and how has the women been treated by the writer, whether the writer is whether the writer has depicted a patriarchal society, whether the writer has been very honest in his depiction of the characters in the play or the novel, or how far has the writer or the dramatist authentically portrayed the women of his age. So this might be covered by the feminist school of criticism. In the same way, the formalism theory will cover how the form of the work lends itself to layers and layers of meaning. Especially in poetry, formalism becomes an important tool because the poet employs n number of figures of speech to communicate his idea and meaning across a range of readers. The critical method. Yes, literature can be enjoyed in two ways. Our preliminary exposure to literature had been those childhood readings where we used to read stories, where we used to listen to poems narrated and shared by our class teachers, came to us across movies or in very many ways. So there is a haphazard way of enjoying literature where you do not record your impressions, you just read it for pure fun. And there is this methodical way of reading which is done by a trained man, as a trained man does. In such cases, the impression is fully accounted for. Why did I like a certain character? What was so beautiful about that piece of poem? Why did the plot of that play stayed in my mind for a long period of time? This kind of impression is carefully and authentically recorded when there is a methodically trained reading of a particular piece of writing. Certain factors condition literary criticism. The most important one is the trends of the age. In a certain age, different aspects dominate. For example, when we were in the age of Renaissance, it was a spirit of inquiry which drove the Renaissance writers and poets to inquire and discover and find out new ways of learning and thinking. So the trend of the age dominated the writings, and most of the work that we find, especially the writings of Bacon, we come to know that there is a strong practical approach to life. If you look at the Romantic age, we find and we come to know that there was a strong urge for freedom. Freedom and liberation was the key word because it was these were the times of the French Revolution. Hence, this kind of spirit is reflected in the writings of William Wordsworth, John Keats, where they just want to break free. So their writings express a kind of a liberation from all controls, from all rules of classical learning. So the trends of the age dominate a piece of writing, and critical approach of one age will be totally different from another age. Attitude of the critic. Since we are talking about the critic, it is important to know the critique and his attitude when he approaches a literary piece of writing. A critic and a writer, both of them are slave to their time. They are driven by their mental makeup, and this will eventually dominate their writings. Critics might look for different aspects in different works, while some might look for morality, others might look for aesthetic pleasure, and that eventually will control and decide their approach to a piece of writing. For example, if a critique is driven by aesthetic pleasure, if he is not able to find that writing aesthetically sound, then he will not give a clear evaluation, because he will only look for aesthetic pleasure. So because of these reasons, some pieces of writing have always fallen short in the eyes of certain critics, while others have done fairly well when they have been evaluated by other critics with a very different approach altogether. We have to analyze everything, because talking about experiences enhances our enjoyment of them. Further, we search for meaning. We just don't read pieces of writing, or we don't look at beautiful paintings of landscape just for pure fun. We are searching for a meaning, what it is trying to communicate to me, what it is trying to say to me. Is there a meaning over it? Is the writer or the poet or the artist trying to express something through those abstract words, because they are not physical entities, they cannot talk to me directly? So is there a hidden meaning over there? So a search of meaning forces us to analyze everything. And as Socrates rightly said once, the life which is unexamined is not worth living. So examining whether it is life or an expression of life becomes all the more important. Finally, we come to the purpose of literary criticism. When we read a piece of writing, we come across different aspects which are not clear to us, which are ambiguous, which are vague, which might be obscure because they have been written during times and ages of which we have no clue, because we were not a part of them. No longer is the writer with us. So how do we understand them? How do we understand the context? How do we get an idea about different expressions which are there? So here criticism performs its very important function of explaining it to the reader, the better of two conflicting readings, because often the different writers have expressed different thoughts in two different kinds of reading. So which one is the best, and whether one reading is contradicting another reading by the same author or by different authors, that is also something that is done by criticism. It also helps us to form judgments about literature, because eventually literature is going to perform a very important function for the society to communicate the best that is known and thought in the world. In which age was it written? What were the social implications, influences on the writing? What were the various trends? What was the role of economic upheavals on that particular writing and its age? Yes, criticism helps us to understand all that. What is written and how the text manipulates the reader, because when the reader is reading the text, the impact of the reading on the reader becomes very important, and how the reader changes after reading the text. All this is covered by literary criticism. And finally, it helps us to understand the relation between authors, readers and text. In a way, a kind of a bond and a connect is established, and this could not have been possible had criticism not performed its functions systematically and scientifically. So we come to connect with the author connects with the reader, and together the two of them get connected to the text. This is ultimately literary criticism, and finally it enhances the enjoyment of our reading of literary work. Thank you.